Hi friend, welcome to A Water Connection, a space created to learn, connect and multiply the power of a conversation to give visibility to the water industry. I am Jess Borges, a passionate human who believes you should increase your water curiosity. Welcome to this new episode. Today, I'm virtually sitting with Danielle Francis. She's going to help us unpack one of the regulatory aspects of the water sector, which is economic regulation. Danielle is currently the Manager of Policy and Strategy at the Water Services Association of Australia. With skills and knowledge from regulatory, strategy, and stakeholder roles, she is dedicated to help the water industry thrive. So, of course, I needed to have her here. She seeks to shape the external policy of environment for better water outcomes. She advocates for all options on the table for water planning, including liveability and circular economy approaches. And she's an advocate for promotion of Indigenous issues, including supporting work to pursue closing the water gap to achieve better water services for First Nations in remote communities around Australia. We're very lucky to have her. Welcome to our Water Connection, Danielle.
Hello, Jess. Thank you. It's great to be here. I share your passion.
Yeah, I can see that, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. I'm very keen on one of the things that I want to explore later on is the connection between regulatory concepts and the future of the sector, considering your experience. But let us start with the basics. What do we mean when we talk about economic water regulation?
Yeah, so basically, economic water regulation means the process by which you have an independent body that essentially sets the prices for a water utility. And what we know is that around Australia, we have varying degrees of that, and it often has sort of slightly different models. Probably the most sort of mature jurisdictions that have the most mature setup for that are New South Wales and Victoria. And you also have independent economic regulation in the ACT and in Tasmania and in South Australia. Slightly less so in Queensland. There's a limited amount of that, and Western Australia doesn't have a sort of a formal economic regulation model. And probably why does that matter? Well, basically it comes back to the fact that water utilities are what we call a natural monopoly, and that is that to provide water services to our customers, it requires really big assets like dams or desalination plants or recycling schemes and then massive pipe networks and filtration plants and so on. And because those assets are so big and they supply everybody, it's what's called an essential service, it doesn't make any sense to duplicate those assets and have different providers in the market. And if you think about that, that's a contrast to something like soft drink manufacturers, for example, or fridges or white good manufacturers or something like that, where in the market you have lots of different players that can provide those products and services. Water is one of those areas, a natural monopoly, where you don't have lots of players because it just doesn't make economic sense to duplicate those assets. They're so huge. And so you tend to have monopoly type industries, which means that there's just one provider of water related services in an area. And so what governments think when they look at that is they say, well, that's great, but what we don't have at play there is the forces of the market. And the forces of the market are that, company A knows that it's kind of battling for market share with company B and company C, and those market forces force them all to be as efficient as possible and continue to strive to keep their prices low and to make their offerings as interesting as possible and as desirable as possible so that customers choose to want to be them. So those market forces are actually good for consumers because competition produces good outcomes. And in the world of economic regulation, there's long been this theory that in the absence of those natural market forces being at play, if you don't have that natural competition, you have economic regulation. And it's a structure that governments set up where they'll basically have an independent entity that can sort of do that role of saying, well, water utilities, we're going to examine all your costs and how much money you need to produce your business, and then we're going to basically make decisions about what prices you can charge to your customers. And it stops things like any temptation to gold plate or to push up prices to have really high profits or something like that. So basically the idea of economic regulation is that it's good for consumers. It provides a level of scrutiny and transparency in the absence of those natural competitive forces.
Yeah, that's very interesting because certainly it is a different industry where we don't have. I was just imagining like two providers of water and then having two dams and two networks of pipelines. That'll be like unthinkable. Like we would never think about doing something like that. So it kind of leads into why do we need that regulation? Who's responsible for that? You mentioned that it was an independent body. Is that like the same for the whole country, or how does that work?
Yep. So what typically governments will do is they'll say, like, it has to be governments who make that happen, and they will create some sort of independent body, and that independent body will have its own piece of legislation that supports it. For example, so in New South Wales you have IPART, the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal. In Victoria you have the Essential Services Commission. In South Australia it's ESCOSA, the Essential Services Commission of South Australia. Queensland you've got the Queensland Competition Authority, and so on. So they're all sort of slightly different, but they all have that similar function. And I guess the features of an independent economic regulator, you really want them to be independent. They do have to be appointed by government, but obviously they look for them to be independent, and they give them, one of the reasons that they have their own Act of Parliament is so that it's very clearly set out what their responsibilities and functions and obligations are, to remove any temptation for political influence or anything like that. And so they will basically have their own powers, and they're essentially funded to do that role of providing that scrutiny. And so they have very, very high level of expertise. So in places, for example, where you don't have a formal independent economic regulator, typically the water utility will still have to go away and say, right, what are our costs going to be for the next 5 years? How much money do we need to provide our services to our customers in an efficient and sensible way that meets all the needs over the next sort of, say, 5 or 10 years? They'll do that. They'll then calculate what their proposed prices are, and they will propose that to government, and it's up to government to kind of confirm that. So it's a similar process, but the difference with economic regulation is a higher degree of expertise of the people involved and a deeper level of scrutiny. And there's also often a public review process that people can participate in. So, for example, a pricing review might take sort of 12 to 18 months, and it has issues papers and business proposals put by both the regulator and the company concerned, where they actually propose and set out all the details of all their expenditure and so on, so that anybody who wants to can participate in that review process and can go along to public hearings or can make a submission and say, oh, I don't agree with X, Y, Z, or basically have their input to that.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. And are those independent regulators only for water, or like would that same independent body regulates other type of industries that are like similar to us?
Absolutely. So independent regulators might have like some control over like energy prices, like you've probably heard of some of the
Yep.
national energy regulators, and that's a national model. And then they often will regulate things like prices for public transport or prices for daycare or local council rates, for example, even things like childcare fees. There's different things, but typically the role of the independent regulator will be more, and telco is another example too, it will be more closely linked to something like industries that are natural monopolies or essential services like, gas, energy, water, telecommunications are really strong examples.
Yeah, okay, that's quite interesting. I mean, I can imagine it a little bit in the urban setting where we have like different water utilities in the big capital cities. But what happens outside of the big cities? Like, are all water providers in the country regulated, or like if there are communities with smaller systems?
No. So what often you'll find is because water services are often provided by the local council outside those big sort of capital or urban areas, and there'll be a process by which an economic regulator might just sort of have a blanket ruling of local government rates or something like that. Like in New South Wales, for example, they have local rate settings, and that includes things like water prices and so on. So there is some degree of economic regulation, but it might be in a way that's done that applies across a range of smaller providers. So an example for New South Wales, where I am now, Sydney Water and Hunter Water have their own enabling act, their own enabling piece of legislation. So that's why they have their own process for economic regulation, and they're also what's called state-owned corporations, whereas other places across the state are essentially, it's local councils who provide water services, and they're all caught under the Local Government Act. So they're grouped in that way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So they are regulated, but maybe through the council and through all the kind of processes. Yeah.
A sort of more collective process. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. And then you mentioned earlier that a price review and like every 5 years. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of how that cycle works in utilities?
Yeah, so that's a really big part of the business of water utilities, and there are some very specialised people who can do things with Microsoft Excel that, average humans like you and I couldn't believe. Yeah, so basically, at the heart of it will be determining the long-term capital and operating plan. So a utility will have all its planners working away busily all the time, saying, what's our long-term forecast, and that can be sort of out to a 40 or 50-year horizon sometimes, because water utilities know things like what's the projection of climate and rainfall and things like that, what's the projection of population growth, how much infrastructure might we need to build to be able to service our communities, and that's both water supply infrastructure and it's also activities like water conservation activities. You don't just build stuff to supply more water. You're always working with your community to make sure that you use what you've got as efficiently as possible. And it's also wastewater infrastructure as well. How do we deal with that part of the water cycle? And stormwater. Now, across the country, stormwater, the level of water utility involvement varies, and it's quite sort of complicated, but there is some degree of stormwater involvement as well. So water utilities are going away all the time, and they have big cycles of planning what their investment needs are going to look like over time. And then once they've produced a big plan about that, they then need to kind of work out a whole lot of financial metrics and things like that. And some of that is about saying, well, for those of it that are run as corporations, how do we also make sure that we're a viable business? This is how much expenditure we need. This is what that might look like in terms of prices. And they have to maintain a reasonable balance sheet to ensure their ongoing sustainability too. And then once they kind of develop all those things, they will often put that as a business proposal to the regulator, and it's a big public document. So it can take a water utility 2 years to put together that big document. It's not unusual for them to be 400 or 500 pages sometimes. So they might have a like a kind of executive summary that sort of summarizes things, but then a lot of detail about all of the different capital programs that they're running. And they also look to demonstrate things like, well, how are we making sure that our operating expenditure is as efficient as possible? What are we doing to make sure that we're keeping our costs as low as we can? And things like with capital, because often water utilities are purchasing really big infrastructure pieces like treatment plants and things like that. They have to demonstrate that they're going through really good procurement processes so that they don't get charged exorbitantly. And it doesn't necessarily mean they will go for the least cost, although there is a kind of the regulatory framework is structured towards sort of not just least cost but best value kind of thing. So that's sort of the opening process, is often that development of those big plans, and then that will all get published. And then the economic regulator will have a look at all of that, and some months later they'll provide a response, and they might have already indicated some of the areas that they want to look at. Like it might be, 5 years ago we were really concerned about some particular aspect of things. So they might have already flagged what they're looking at, or it might be a change in the regulatory environment. Like it might be that, you now have competition has been enabled in a particular jurisdiction. So we're really keen this time to understand how that interacts with what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And a regulator will have a couple of key things that they look at, and these are called the prudency and the efficiency test. And the prudency and the efficiency test means, first of all, they look for the prudency of the proposed expenditure. And the prudency means, should you do the thing you are proposing to do, i.e., do you need to? An example of how you might demonstrate that your proposed expenditure is prudent might be, for example, if you need to install a higher level of treatment on a wastewater treatment plant or a recycled water plant, for example, you could demonstrate the prudency of that by saying, well, I've got a license from the EPA on this particular plant, and the EPA license says that I need to meet this standard to be able to discharge recycled water or treated water into this waterway. Therefore, I can't meet that standard without applying this level of treatment. Therefore, that's why I'm proposing that I need that expenditure. So first of all, they'll say, right, is there a justification of doing the activity at all, or could you leave it for another 20 years or do something else, for example? Then they look for efficiency, and efficiency is that aspect of, well, can you convince me that you're doing it not just for the least cost possible, but for the best value possible? So it won't always be the cheapest, literally lowest cost, but have you shown me that there's no gold plating, or that there aren't big margins floating in here? Show me that you're doing it as well as you can. And so they'll look for all those things, and then they also look at these really complicated metrics. Like there's a thing called weighted average cost of capital, which is WACC, which is sort of a big term that really kind of means things like interest rates. And so, in the same way that people who own homes are always looking at interest rates, and because that impacts your mortgages, well, those forces are at play in economic regulation too, because water utilities operate in a financial market just like everybody else. And so part of the price calculation process is determining, well, what's an appropriate sort of interest rate that should be earned and so on by some of the water utilities. So they look at all those things, and then there's an invitation for public submissions. And I mean, I have to say, it's good to have the ability for members of the public to make public submissions, but the level of economic literacy is reasonably high, and sometimes you do see the members of the public engage, and that's fantastic. But often you have to be pretty well versed in some of the economic concepts to understand some of the detail. So you'll have everything from a regular person who says, "I just don't think you should build this treatment plant in that location," for example, to and you have a lot of stakeholder representative groups, like you might have the ombudsman in a particular state, or groups that represent the social interests of vulnerable customers or something like that might make submissions as well. All of those things get taken into consideration. There's often a public hearing where people are invited to present different proposals and present their point of view. Typically, a regulator will then make a draft determination, which is, and it's, again, quite a long, detailed thing, and it sort of says, here's what we believe are going to be the prices that you can charge for your customers. And after the draft determination, the utility concerned can make a response back and say, okay, here's our response to the draft determination. We think, we don't agree with this, we do agree with that, a whole lot of different things. And then eventually there will be a final determination. And a final determination is basically the decision is final. Sometimes built into the framework, there's something called a merits review, which is essentially kind of like a right of an appeal to go higher if you think there's been something wrong, but typically the final determination is the final determination, and the utility will then go and implement those prices, and that becomes the prices that utility can charge customers for, and it's typically the typical period can be anything from 3 to 5, but 4 or 5 years is sort of a common period, a common duration for a pricing term.
Yeah, it's definitely quite a convoluted process, and for utilities, if they have to do it every 3 years, for example, it's like all the time. Like you finish one and you start the next one, I would imagine, because it's like a lot of justification they have to build on to present that to the regulator.
That's exactly it, and that is it. And I mean, even at a 5-year determination, utilities basically they finish one cycle of price regulation, and as soon as they start, applying those prices to customers, they are going away, and then they're starting the next one, and they're analysing, right, what's been our revenue and all of these different aspects. So it really is sort of an ongoing cycle, and you just said it's convoluted. It is quite an involved process, and I guess the idea is that it's an appropriate level of robustness to make sure that an essential service that most customers, can't do without are getting good value for money and are getting a well packaged, service and paying an appropriate amount for it.
Absolutely. You are able to see like what you pay, exactly how is that being used, or how is it planned to be used in the next whatever years for it. And from the side of the regulator, do they check like every single, because like project that people like that the solar utility is proposing, because it sounds like they also needed to know like a lot of knowledge from like how the sector works, and even like technically to see if that was a prudent and efficient solution.
Yeah. Look, no, I don't think it's possible for them to check every single thing. So what they will typically do is that they will look at the overall quantum that's proposed as, for example, a capital program, and say, right, let's look at it. And then they will actually often get auditors within, and they'll say, all right, now we're going to take a deep dive into a selection of projects. And they might pick a selection for, it might be some of the biggest, and it might be some of the smaller ones. It might be ones that have been drawn to their attention for a particular reason, like, this was topical last time, or we know there's customer concern about whatever, and so they'll go through that process. So it's quite a long and involved process. And what we've actually seen in the last sort of decade or so, if you like, as a bit of a regulatory trend, is a move towards greater customer centricity, and that is that, and it's kind of followed a bit of change over in the UK. And what it was that regulators were saying, right, we know our job is to set the prices, but what we're starting to find is that water utilities focus really just on satisfying us and on convincing us of their expenditure. but we're just we don't want to be we're not the customer. We're a proxy in a way for that, but we don't want to be the customer. And what we want now is water utilities don't just convince us that you think it's a good idea. We want you to go away and have a really good interaction with your customers. Do customer willingness to pay surveys, do deep engagement so that you understand what's the level of services that they expect and are willing to pay for. And then as part of your process, show us that you've got the evidence of what customers want, because we don't want to just choose what we think your customers want. We want you to show us the evidence that you've carefully understood what your customers want and that your proposals are corresponding well to that.
Yeah, well, for someone that might not be that familiar with, what does that mean, like the willingness to pay studies? Like, do they go and ask people? Like, how would they explain that to people? Like, do you want to pay X amount of dollars for them?
Yeah.
Is that how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some, there's different sort of economic models that you use that, like choice modeling and, different things like that, different ways of doing it. It's quite a specialized form of kind of economic market research. And they will literally go out and they will survey customers in a particular market and say, here's what we're proposing to do. This is what impact it might have on your bills. Can you indicate your level of support for it? And it's quite a tricky thing, because what's often easier for utility, that example I gave before where I said, you can demonstrate prudency where you've got a license requirement from the EPA that says you must do this. Now, the license requirement from the EPA won't say, for example, the only way you can achieve this level of treatment is through installing reverse osmosis. They won't dictate the input, but they will dictate the outcome that you need. That's probably an easier thing to explain to your economic regulator, is to show this is my mandate. This is why I need to do this thing, because clear it's a law that requires me to do it.
To comply with that, yeah.
Yeah. The customer willingness to pay is harder because it's a little bit more fluid. And most of the regulators, they will have guidance on how you go about following this customer willingness to pay pathway. But it's kind of hard because if you're a business and you might be saying, we want to do something that's a bit new and different. For example, we want to, instead of managing stormwater by just building a big grey concrete drain and taking that water away to the coast and getting rid of it, which has been the traditional grey asset approach, an example might be utilities these days might say, I want to do something that's a bit more nature-based and it's a bit more environmentally sensitive. I want to build a wetland or something like that. And then it's going to be great because it's going to be more visually appealing, and it also can be kind of built as a bit of a park space, which means that it provides some amenity for local people to go and sit in that park, and it offers biodiversity benefits and things like that. So they might say, we want to do that. And it might not be if it's the least cost approach, well, that's easy because you can say, I'm meeting my required outcomes via the least cost, easy. Yeah. But if it's not as cheap as, say, a grey drain, you might go down the customer willingness to pay pathway, in which you'd have to say, right, I'm going to go and survey our customers and say, do they want these outcomes? Do they do these things? The regulators provide guidance on how to go about it, but what they won't really tell you is a very, very clear goalpost that says you have to demonstrate, for example, 90% support for this amount of dollars. And they can't. It's very hard for them to do that because it depends on what you're proposing. If you're proposing something that only adds $1 to the bill, well, the threshold's probably going to be a bit lower. If you're proposing something that's going to add 40% to the typical whole customer bill, obviously the threshold is going to be much higher because it's going to have much more an impact on your customers. So they're going to look for a much more high degree of customer support for that. So it's in some ways it's a path that you follow that it's hard to know in advance if you're going to be able to demonstrate it. But obviously, utilities will do it where they think, and there have certainly been examples where places have been able to go do something by demonstrating customer willingness to pay.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good way to involve community as well in the process of creating these solutions. Like there will be involvement in community to see the plan in that regulatory submission, and then can go on and give the feedback, but if they're also kind of included from the beginning. And I think that example that you're given is super good because it's something that might be more expensive. We don't know. This is an example, but it will give them a lot of more benefits in different ways that people might also value, not only in just get rid of my rainwater and then just take it away. Like we are definitely changing that shift into something that is more holistic and nature-based. So, Danielle, what is I had a question about like the role of WSAA, or the institution where you work, because you're the industry body that connects, and this is what I read in the website, the urban water sector, and included these regulation matters. How do you provide like a broader perspective to utilities into how the regulation works in other states? Because if it is an independent process in the states, do you provide that platform for utilities to learn from what other people are doing, or what is the role of WASA there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we're the peak body for the urban water industry. And urban water, what we mean by that, we don't mean rural water that's used for agriculture and irrigation. We mean town water, or water that's used for communities and people. So our members are most of the water utilities across Australia and some of the big ones in New Zealand as well. And the role that we play is that we're effectively a forum, if you like. We bring them all together because it's really important for jurisdictions to be able to learn what's happening in other jurisdictions, because that might mean what's on the horizon for me that might be sort of coming towards my jurisdiction at some point in time, or, we've got a real problem here that we haven't managed to solve. Can I learn from someone over there about how they've managed to solve that? What are some, good approaches that are gaining credence and things like that? So that's really valuable in terms of bringing people together and that cross-exposure and cross-learning. And the other thing that WASA does is we're often talked about as the national voice for the water industry. And so, for example, there's something called the National Water Initiative, which was like a blueprint for reform that was created about 20 years ago. And it was something that was created by the federal government, and they got all of the state and territory governments to sign up to it. And it had a whole bunch of outcomes and actions set out that said, here is how a blueprint for reform and how as a sector we're going to move forward and get better and provide better services to customers. Right now, that's being renewed, and there's a process to develop a renewal, which is great because it hasn't been renewed for about 20 years. So, for example, WAS is playing a big role in that. We're working with the different governments, and particularly with the federal government that's taking on the role of creating a new one, renewing it. Because we're kind of working with members all across the country, we can sort of see what are the common themes that are important in all places around the country. It might have a different flavour in the different jurisdictions, but what are the things that are really coming through is really important. And because of the fact that we've got that sort of contextual understanding of how things are different versus what are the common threads that are important to everyone, we're well placed to be able to prepare submissions to provide to the federal government and liaise with them and help give them an understanding of what are the themes that are important across the board to other places versus things that are really specific to only a particular location, for example, that the National Water Initiative probably will be less focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of a role, like it's covering like the whole state, the different states, and providing that unified kind of view. Danielle, I mentioned in the introduction that you are like a national and international advocate for all options on the table for water planning and circular economy. I have a burning question here, but first, could you give us a definition of the concept of all options on the table to make sure that everyone that is listening might be in the same page?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we talk about all options on the table, we're talking about the fact that the way we supply water to communities is evolving. So traditionally, the way that we've done that is that we've had surface water, which means rivers and dams, and that's what provides our communities. And they've always been the backbone of our supply, and they're fantastic. But what we're finding, and we observe this around the world and around Australia, is that as the climate is becoming variable, and sometimes rainfall is becoming less reliable in a lot of places, jurisdictions are starting to complement those traditional sources of water with water supply sources that are less reliant on rainfall or climate independent. And so what that means is classically things like desalination, recycled water is for irrigation and industry and so on, and purified recycled water, which is purifying that recycled water to an absolutely incredibly pure degree and using it for drinking water as part of drinking water supplies. So when we talk about all options on the table, it's about saying that as we move forward into the future, and already when we're planning how we provide a secure and reliable and safe water supply to our communities, we need to be open to all of the different options. And there's about 10 options. So rivers and dams are great. I mentioned purified recycled water, desalination, recycled water. Stormwater reuse is another option that can have a place. Water efficiency, it doesn't make more water, but it makes sure we use the water we've got safely. Water carting, which is an emergency response that sometimes towns will do if they're really drought-stricken. Transfers, like sometimes places will build pipelines so that if they're water poor, if they've got a neighbour that's water rich, they can share, and that's fantastic. So there's about 10 different options that are available to water planners these days in their toolkit. And all options on the table is about saying, in the past, sometimes some of those options have been off the table for different reasons. And the different reasons might be because there's been some hesitation or there's been some reluctance on the part of either a community or a regulator or a government or a stakeholder or a decision maker about looking at particular options, or sometimes there's specific regulatory impediments or policy impediments that stop it from happening. All options on the table is about saying that as we move forward into the future, the way that we provide water is changing, and we absolutely need to have all those options on the table. Which ones will be the right options and the right portfolio of options will depend based on the geography of your location. But these days, water supply, we don't put all our eggs in one basket anymore. Diversification is what gives us water security. So it's not just about having one wonderful dam that has heaps of water, because a dam, if you're not getting any rain, a dam empties and it's just an empty bucket. So yeah, all options on the table about being open to those things. And there's really been a big shift. Like over in the past 15 years, the amount of policy voices that have been really urging for all options to be on the table, like Infrastructure Australia, the Productivity Commission, so many different voices are saying we absolutely need to have all options on the table. And that includes things like, in some places there's been dams that have been unpopular in the past. They need to be on the table that water planners can look at them. Purified recycled water. And there's been sometimes when, there was a referendum in Toowoomba 15 or 20 years ago where, that it didn't pass. That's okay. Things have moved on a lot since then, and what we need is all those options to be available to planners so that they can work out what's the best reliable area for their jurisdiction.
Yeah, clearly. And what is the role of economic regulation in this, in enabling these novel and kind of these all options and opening the doors for is there something that regulation can do to foster that utilities and different places and councils to look into all of those options?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, economic regulation is about cost, and one of the really big aspects that planners will look at when determining what's the right portfolio of options is what is the cost. So, whether the cost for a piece of new infrastructure is $2 billion or whether it's, $20 million, either way, it has to go through the economic regulation gateway. And obviously, if you're looking at the more expensive option, it's because you need to demonstrate that there's a need for that. And there's not just economic regulation of the water industry. You also have that environmental regulation. Yes. So you need to demonstrate the environmental effectiveness and it's protecting the environment. There's also the public health aspect. So, water suppliers have to demonstrate that it's going to meet public health. So all those things together effectively form gateways, if you like, that water utilities will have to satisfy to show that particular options that they're looking at is safe. But we do talk about that quite a lot, because what we're finding is that in other parts of the world, you really are seeing a lot of this diversification towards desalination and purified recycled water. California has, I think, 3 desalination plants and about a couple of dozen either planned or already operating purified recycled water schemes. Africa has quite a lot as well. And so I think we are going to see that we are seeing more and more of that shift.
Yeah, absolutely. Linked to that and to the future, what do you think is the biggest challenge that we're facing in this space of economic regulation in the water sector?
What I think is the biggest challenge is that, economic regulation serves to keep bills not as low as possible, but as good value as possible. But in the same way that we've all enjoyed low interest rates for a few years on our mortgages, during COVID, interest rates were pretty low and it was actually pretty good. Interest rates were low. But how in the last year or so they've actually risen dramatically because the world has changed and the market forces have changed a lot as a post-COVID thing. Water bills are not immune to that. Water utilities operate in the financial markets too. And that is likely to see that the nice low bills that we've enjoyed for a sort of steady period for a while are going to go up, and that's even without actual new assets. So you've got a couple of storms on the horizon for it's not for economic regulation itself, but in terms of water bills, the fact that those financial conditions are changing are one thing that's going to start pushing water bills back up again. The fact that with climate change and increasing populations and so on, water utilities also then have to invest in actual new pieces of infrastructure like recycling plants or purified recycled water plants or desalination plants. So that's a big investment that also is going to have an impact on bills as well. So, water bills are actually, they're a pretty reasonable proportion of most households' disposable income. They're only, typically a couple of percent or under 3%. And they're probably not as high as something like energy bills. But cost of living is really, an issue across the board for many people. So obviously there's great sensitivity to any of those things going up. So, that is an outlook that we can't avoid. And whilst no one likes price rises, we have to maintain our essential services. And we've got a lot of assets in the water industry that have really long lives. So water industry assets, they're not like, in IT, you might upgrade your computer every 2 to 4 years or something like that. Water industry assets, a lot of them you might build and you don't look at them again for another 100 years. That's how long lasting they are, and they're underground. But when it does come the time to have to replace them, those are big investments, and water utilities are really good at kind of keeping things going so that you don't invest until you really, really have to. But we are looking across the country at a pretty substantial increase and quite a lot of billions of dollars that are going to be needed invested to be able to keep providing our services safely to our communities.
Yeah, that's certainly one part that is sometimes we don't think about much. Like I have a very technical role, but I don't get into exposure to this part of kind of the sector, which is very important, and it's going to affect the community as well directly into how they pay the bills. Danielle, what would be your message for other young water professionals that might be listening to you right now?
My message to young water professionals is that I think you've made a fabulous choice to be in the water industry because it's a wonderful place to be. There's so much interest to learn about. There's everything from engineering, from asset management to economics to stakeholder management to research to science. It's a really, to operations, it's a wonderful field to be in, and I think it's great. The other thing that I think is great about the water industry is that we provide really equitable services to communities. The way that water bills are set up, usually with postage stamp pricing, it means that we provide an essential service to people, but for really good value. So I think I would say to water industry people, enjoy the career path that you've chosen and explore all the different opportunities that are available to you in water, and keep doing the good work that you're doing.
Yeah, nice. And connected to this and to finish up, why do you work in the water industry? Might be similar to what you just replied.
Yeah, look, I love the water industry. Day to day, I can't wait to get up and get into doing what I'm doing. And I think the fact that water is a bit under the radar, most of us, we take for granted the fact that we have this wonderful, amazing water supply, but many places around the world, they don't have such a good water supply. So we are lucky to have that. I feel very lucky to be part of that. And I love the collaborative nature of the water industry, as opposed to industries that are highly competitive and commercial and really, not trying to help each other. I really love the worldwide collaboration that we see in the water industry because most people are just motivated by this idea of providing sustainable services to people. And it's that's my why. I find it a great place to be.
Yeah, it is. And as you say, it's like providing an essential service. And like, I think that point that you made of like not having competition is like, well, I mean, we're all in here for the same thing. So we should just work together. And then that is something that a lot of other guests have also highlighted of the water sector is how collaborative we are.
Well, that's right. I mean, I should say it's not that there isn't competition because there is plenty of competition within the water industry. Like some places have specific competition frameworks set up, and you are now seeing more and more private participation in the water industry. And also in the procurement of services, there's a huge amount of competition for who we buy our assets from and who delivers our services and so on. And that's a really healthy thing and gives good outcomes for customers. But even within that, there's just a really great degree of collaboration.
Yeah. Danielle, thank you very much for your time today. It was amazing, like this conversation and this economic regulation 101 kind of overview. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
And to you, my friend, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to this episode with Danielle Francis of Our Water Connection. I hope you enjoyed the ride. Follow us on LinkedIn as Our Water Connection to hear all updates and new episodes coming. Until next time.